I don't care who he is. Know your place. You people always think you can do whatever you want. Step out of the vehicle, now! The only mistake here is you! Get out, now!
This cannot continue. We demand justice now.
Yeah!
The community will not be silenced.
Step out of the vehicle, now. The command cut through the humid Georgia afternoon like a blade. Officer Derek Hutchins stood beside the dusty sedan, one hand resting on his belt, the other gripping the door frame. His jaw was set, his eyes cold behind mirrored sunglasses that reflected the trembling hands of the elderly man in the driver's seat. "Sir, I haven't done anything wrong," the man said softly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his fingers. He was in his late 70s, maybe early 80s, with silver hair and deep brown skin weathered by decades under the sun. His pressed white shirt was buttoned to the collar, and a faded military pin gleamed on his chest. "I said get out." Hutchins's voice rose sharply. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk outside the Riverside Community Center, phones already lifted, recording. The parking lot shimmered with heat, and the air felt thick, charged with something unspoken. The elderly man slowly reached for his seatbelt, moving with deliberate care. But Hutchins wasn't patient. He yanked the door open wider, grabbed the man's arm, and pulled. Hard. "Hey, wait," someone in the crowd shouted. The man stumbled as Hutchins dragged him from the car, his knees buckling slightly as his polished shoes scraped against the asphalt. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. A woman covered her mouth. A teenager's phone shook as he zoomed in. "You think you can just ignore me?" Hutchins barked, forcing the man's hands behind his back. The elderly man didn't resist, but his face tightened with pain as the officer's grip dug into his wrists. "Officer, please," the man said, his voice still calm, though something flickered in his eyes. Something deep, something unshakable. "You're making a mistake." Hutchins laughed bitterly. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can park wherever you want and talk back to me." The crowd grew larger. Whispers spread like wildfire. Someone shouted about calling a lawyer. Another person started live-streaming. The officer's partner, a younger cop named Miller, shifted uncomfortably by the patrol car, watching but not intervening. Hutchins shoved the elderly man against the hood of the sedan, the metal warm under the sun. The man's chest pressed flat, his breathing controlled, his eyes closed for just a moment. When he opened them again, there was no anger, only resolve. "What's your name?" Hutchins demanded, reaching for his handcuffs. The man's lips parted, but before he could answer, a voice from the crowd cut through the tension. "That's Colonel James William Carter." Hutchins froze. His hand hovered over the cuffs. He turned slowly toward the voice, a middle-aged black woman in business attire standing near the community center entrance. Her expression was horrified, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "What did you say?" Hutchins asked, irritation creeping into his tone. The woman stepped forward, her voice louder now. "That man you're manhandling, that's Colonel James William Carter, retired Air Force, 38 years of service." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Hutchins's jaw tightened, but he didn't release his grip on the colonel's arm. "I don't care if he's the Pope," Hutchins snapped. He was parked illegally and refused to comply. But something had shifted. The energy in the parking lot crackled differently now. The phones recording weren't just capturing police aggression anymore. They were capturing something bigger, something that would soon spiral far beyond this small Georgia town. Colonel Carter lifted his head slightly, his gaze meeting Hutchins's through the reflection in the car window. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the weight of decades. "You should have checked the registration. Where are you from? Tell us in the comments below. And if you're loving this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more." James William Carter had never been a man who demanded respect. He earned it, quietly, consistently. Over nearly 4 decades of service that took him from the red clay of rural Georgia to the command centers of conflicts most Americans would never hear about. Born in 1946 in a sharecropper's cabin outside Macon, James grew up watching his father break his back in fields that would never belong to him. His mother cleaned houses for white families in town, coming home with stories of casual cruelty she endured with grace James didn't understand until much later. They had nothing, but they had standards. His father taught him to stand tall. His mother taught him that dignity wasn't given, it was kept. At 17, James enlisted in the Air Force. Vietnam was raging, and black soldiers were dying at disproportionate rates, but James saw the military as his only path out of Georgia's suffocating poverty. What he found instead was purpose. He discovered he had a mind for strategy, a calm under pressure that made commanders take notice. By 23, he'd earned his officer commission. By 30, he was leading operations. By 45, he was one of the highest-ranking black officers in the Air Force. But James never forgot where he came from. He returned to Riverside, Georgia, every chance he got, buying his parents a small house near the community center where he'd once played basketball on cracked concrete. After his father's death and then his mother's, James kept that house. He kept coming back. Even after retiring with full honors, even after moving to a comfortable home in Virginia, Riverside remained his anchor. He'd arrived this morning for the annual Veterans Day planning meeting at the community center. James had been volunteering with the local VFW chapter for years, helping organize events, mentoring young veterans struggling to adjust to civilian life. He parked in his usual spot, the same spot he'd parked in for a decade, right beside the accessible entrance. The meeting wasn't for another hour, so he sat in his car, reading through notes, sipping coffee from a thermos his late wife had given him 20 years ago. He didn't notice Officer Hutchins pull into the lot, didn't see the way Hutchins's eyes locked onto James's car with something close to irritation, didn't hear the muttered comment Hutchins made to his partner about people who think they own the place. James had learned long ago that some people saw his quiet confidence as arrogance, saw his refusal to shrink himself as defiance. He'd dealt with it in the military, navigated it with patience and excellence that left no room for doubt. He thought those days were behind him. He was wrong. Inside the community center, Director Lisa Matthews was setting up chairs in the main hall when she heard the commotion outside. She rushed to the window and felt her stomach drop. She knew James. Everyone in Riverside knew Colonel Carter. He'd donated funds to renovate the center's kitchen. He'd personally mentored her son when he returned from deployment with PTSD. He was, in every sense, a pillar of this community. And now he was being dragged from his car like a criminal. Lisa's hands shook as she pulled out her phone, but she didn't know who to call first. The police, the mayor, the Air Force. James had connections everywhere, but would it matter? Would anyone believe her fast enough? Marcus Thompson, a young veteran James had been mentoring, stood frozen near the basketball courts behind the center. He'd been shooting hoops, waiting for the meeting, when he heard raised voices. Now he watched through the chain-link fence, his jaw clenched, his own trauma from police encounters flooding back. He wanted to intervene, but fear rooted him in place. Fear of making it worse. Fear of becoming the next target. Sarah Chen, a local reporter for the Riverside Gazette, had been across the street grabbing coffee when she heard the shouting. She sprinted toward the scene, her press badge bouncing against her chest, her mind already formulating questions. But when she got close enough to see who was being arrested, her professional detachment cracked. She'd interviewed James last year for a Veterans Day feature. He'd been gracious, humble, focused entirely on honoring others rather than himself. This wasn't right. The crowd continued to swell. Phones captured every angle. Social media notifications began pinging across the county, then the state. A video titled "Cop ATTACKS Elderly Black Man" started climbing Twitter's trending topics. But none of them knew yet just how badly Officer Hutchins had miscalculated. None of them knew that Colonel James William Carter wasn't just a decorated veteran. He wasn't just a respected community leader. He was something else entirely. Something that would bring this situation crashing down in ways no one could predict. Hutchins tightened the cuffs around James's wrists, ignoring the growing protests from the crowd. Miller finally spoke up. Derek, maybe we should. Stay out of it, Hutchins snapped. James remained silent, his eyes scanning the crowd calmly. He saw Lisa at the window, saw Marcus by the fence, saw the cameras recording. He took a slow breath, centering himself the way he had before every high-stakes mission. This wasn't over, it was just beginning. The trigger had been simple, absurdly simple, a parking spot. Officer Derek Hutchins had been having a bad week. His shift supervisor had written him up for excessive force complaints, the third time this year. His wife had served him divorce papers. His teenage daughter wasn't speaking to him. When he pulled into the Riverside Community Center parking lot for a routine patrol, he was looking for something to control, someone to remind that he still had authority. He saw James's car parked beside the accessible entrance, a spot technically reserved for individuals with disability placards, and something in him snapped. Never mind that James had been parking there for years with explicit permission from the center's director. Never mind that the parking lot was nearly empty. Never mind that James had a legitimate mobility issue from an old service injury, documented in his medical records. Hutchins saw an opportunity to assert dominance, and he took it. He approached the car with aggression already simmering beneath his professional mask. James looked up from his notes, mildly surprised but not alarmed. He'd dealt with police his entire life. He knew the dance. "Can I help you, officer?" James asked politely, rolling down his window. "You're parked illegally," Hutchins said flatly. "I need to see your license and registration." James nodded, reaching slowly for his glove compartment. "Of course, though I should mention I have permission from Director Matthews to park here. I'm a regular volunteer." "I didn't ask for your life story," Hutchins interrupted. "License and registration, now." The tone shift was unmistakable. James's hand paused. He looked at Hutchins, really looked at him, and recognized something he'd seen countless times before. This wasn't about parking. This was about power, about putting someone in their place. James handed over his documents. His military ID was clipped to his sun's visor, visible if Hutchins had bothered to look. But Hutchins barely glanced at the license before dropping it on the ground beside the car. "Oops," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. The crowd that had begun to gather inhaled collectively. This wasn't procedure. This was cruelty. James's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, preparing to retrieve his license from the ground. "Stay in the vehicle," Hutchins barked. James froze. "Officer, you dropped my—" "I said stay in the vehicle." Hutchins's hand moved to his weapon, not drawing it but resting there. A threat, a reminder of who held the power. Miller, watching from the patrol car, felt his stomach churn. This was escalating too fast, but he'd seen what happened to cops who questioned Hutchins. He stayed silent. "Sir," James said, his voice still controlled, "I'm simply trying to comply. My license is on the ground. What would you like me to do?" Hutchins leaned closer, his face inches from the window. "What I'd like is for you to show some respect. You people always think you can do whatever you want." The words hung in the air like poison. "You people," the crowd erupted in angry shouts. James's expression didn't change, but something flickered deep in his eyes. A lifetime of this. A lifetime of biting his tongue, choosing battles, maintaining composure while rage burned beneath the surface. He'd commanded troops in war zones, advised generals, sat across from foreign dignitaries. And here he was being called "you people" in a parking lot in his own hometown. "I'm going to ask you one more time," James said quietly, each word measured. "What would you like me to do, officer?" Hutchins's face flushed red. The question, asked so calmly, felt like a challenge, like defiance. He couldn't have that, not in front of all these phones. "Get out of the car, now." And that's when everything exploded. James began to step out slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. But Hutchins grabbed his arm before he was fully out, yanking him forward. James's knee, the one that still ached from shrapnel he'd taken in the Gulf War, buckled. He stumbled, and Hutchins used that momentum to spin him around and slam him against the car. The crowd surged forward. "He's not resisting," someone screamed. "Get your hands off him," another voice shouted. Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd, her press badge held high. "Officer, officer, I'm with the Riverside Gazette. Can you explain what's happening here?" Hutchins ignored her, forcing James's arms behind his back. James winced but didn't cry out. He'd endured worse pain, much worse. But the humiliation of it, the public degradation, cut deeper than any physical injury. "You're making a mistake," James said again, his voice steady despite the pain shooting through his shoulder. "The only mistake is you mouthing off to a police officer," Hutchins growled. Lisa Matthews finally broke free from her shock inside the community center. She burst through the front doors, running toward the scene. "Stop! Stop this right now! That's Colonel Carter. He has every right to be here." Hutchins barely glanced at her. "Ma'am, step back or I'll arrest you for interfering." "Interfering?" Lisa's voice cracked with disbelief. "He's a volunteer here. He was invited. He has permission to park there." "I don't care who he is," Hutchins said, pulling out his handcuffs. "He's under arrest for failure to comply, disorderly conduct, and resisting an officer." The charges were absurd. Everyone watching knew it. The videos would prove it. But in that moment, Hutchins had the badge, the gun, and the authority, and he was determined to use all three. James's breathing remained controlled, but his mind was racing. He thought about his late wife, Alina, who'd begged him to stop volunteering in Riverside after a similar incident 5 years ago. He thought about the young veterans he mentored, watching this, learning that even decades of service meant nothing when faced with the wrong officer on the wrong day. He thought about the envelope in his glove compartment, the one he'd planned to show Lisa after the meeting, the one that would have made this entire situation impossible if Hutchins had simply looked at the car's registration properly. But Hutchins hadn't looked, hadn't cared to look, and now the consequences of that oversight were about to cascade in ways that would shake this entire county. "You're arresting him?" Marcus finally found his voice from the fence, his own hands trembling. "For what? For existing while black." The crowd roared its agreement. Someone started chanting. Others joined in. The energy shifted from shocked observation to collective outrage. Hutchins felt it, the loss of control, and that made him angrier. He snapped the first cuff onto James's wrist, tighter than necessary. James closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. When he opened them, he spoke, his voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. "Officer Hutchins, I'm giving you one final opportunity to check that vehicle registration, for your own sake." The way he said it made Hutchins pause. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't begging. It was a warning, and something about it unsettled him. But pride wouldn't let him back down now, not with everyone watching. "Too late for that," Hutchins said, reaching for the second cuff. That's when the first call came through on his radio. The voice on the other end was Captain Richard Morrison, Hutchins's precinct commander. His tone was clipped, urgent. "Hutchins, what's your 20? Hutchins pressed the button on his shoulder radio, irritation clear in his voice. "Riverside Community Center, making an arrest for." "Stand down immediately." The words hit like a physical blow. The crowd fell silent, sensing something shift. Even James turned his head slightly, though his expression remained neutral. "Sir," Hutchins said, confusion replacing his confidence. "Release the individual and step away. That's an order." Hutchins's hand froze on James's wrist. Miller walked over from the patrol car, his face pale. "Derek, maybe we should." "I don't understand," Hutchins said into the radio, ignoring his partner. "This suspect was non-compliant and—" "He's not a suspect." Morrison's voice rose sharply. "Do you have any idea who you just put hands on?" The crowd pressed closer, phones still recording every second. Lisa Matthews's hand covered her mouth, relief and vindication flooding through her. Sarah Chen's fingers flew across her phone, texting her editor. This was bigger than a local story now. Hutchins's face cycled through emotions, confusion, defensiveness, then the first flickers of fear. "Captain, I was just doing my job. He was parked illegally, refused to comply." "He owns the building, Hutchins. He owns the entire community center. It's his property. The words fell into the hot Georgia afternoon like stones into still water, sending ripples through everyone present. Own the building? The crowd erupted in exclamations. Miller actually stepped back, his eyes widening. Lisa closed her eyes, nodding slowly. She'd known, of course. But hearing it said out loud, hearing Hutchins realize his mistake in real time, was almost cathartic. Hutchins's hand went slack on the cuff. He stared at the back of James's silver-haired head, comprehension slowly dawning. What? Colonel James William Carter donated the funds to purchase and renovate that entire facility 8 years ago, Morrison continued, his voice hard as iron. He holds the deed. The parking lot you're standing in? His. The building? His. And from what I'm hearing, you just assaulted him on his own property in front of about 50 witnesses and a dozen cameras. The second cuff clattered to the ground. Hutchins's hands fell to his sides. James turned slowly, his wrist still bearing the red marks from the single cuff. He looked at Hutchins with an expression that wasn't quite pity but wasn't anger either. It was something worse, disappointment. I tried to tell you, James said quietly. But that was only the beginning, because what Morrison hadn't said yet, what he didn't know yet, was that Colonel James William Carter's connections ran far deeper than property ownership. His phone was ringing right now in his pocket, vibrating against his hip. The caller ID, if anyone had looked, would have shown a Washington, D.C. area code, a Pentagon extension specifically. Because while James had been sitting in his car, reviewing notes for a veterans meeting, he'd also been waiting for a call about his nomination. A nomination to serve on the National Veterans Affairs Advisory Board. A nomination approved just this morning by the Secretary of Defense himself. But even that wasn't the whole story. The envelope in James's glove compartment contained something else. Something that would arrive in Riverside within the hour, bringing with it a reckoning that Officer Derek Hutchins couldn't begin to imagine. Marcus moved closer to the fence, his hands gripping the chain link as understanding dawned. He'd known the colonel had money, had influence, but this was different. Sarah Chen's phone buzzed with a message from her editor, getting calls from state police. What's happening there? She looked up at James, standing tall despite everything, despite the pain in his knee, despite the humiliation. She typed back, a cop just made the worst mistake of his career. Hutchins finally found his voice, though it came out strangled. I didn't know. You didn't ask, James said simply. You saw an elderly black man and made assumptions. You saw someone you thought you could bully. You were wrong. The crowd erupted in applause and shouts of support. Miller backed away from his partner, creating physical distance as if Hutchins's mistake might be contagious. But Hutchins, despite everything, despite the captain's orders, despite the irrefutable evidence of his error, couldn't quite let go. Pride, that toxic, destructive pride, made him defensive. I was following protocol, he insisted. You were parked in a handicapped spot without a placard visible. The placard is on the rearview mirror, Lisa called out. It's been there the whole time. Hutchins turned, and indeed, hanging from James's mirror was a clear disability parking permit. Valid, current, visible to anyone who'd bothered to look before escalating. The silence that followed was damning. James slowly reached up and removed the single cuff still dangling from his wrist. He held it out to Hutchins, who took it automatically, his hands trembling now. I'm going to walk into that community center, James said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. I'm going to attend my meeting, and when I'm done, I'm going to file a formal complaint about what happened here today, not for me, but for every other person who doesn't have the resources, the connections, or the documentation to defend themselves when you decide they don't belong. He turned to walk away, but Morrison's voice crackled through the radio again. Hutchins, one more thing, don't go anywhere. Internal affairs is en route, and you might want to get a lawyer. The crowd's energy shifted from outrage to something approaching satisfaction. Justice, delayed but coming. Miller looked at his partner with something close to horror, already mentally drafting the statement that would separate him from Hutchins's actions. James took 3 steps toward the community center before he paused. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly. The registration you never checked. It lists the property owner, my name, and my title. You would have known who I was if you'd simply done your job properly. He continued walking, each step measured, his posture military straight despite the pain. The crowd parted for him like water, many people applauding, others calling out support. Lisa rushed to his side, her hand on his arm, guiding him toward the entrance. But just as James reached the door, another sound cut through the afternoon. A sound that made everyone's head turn skyward. A sound that shouldn't have been there in this small Georgia town on a random Tuesday afternoon. Helicopter rotors, multiple helicopters. 3 Black Hawks appeared over the tree line, flying in formation, heading directly toward the community center. The crowd gasped, confusion rippling through them. Police helicopters, news choppers, what was happening? Hutchins looked up, his face draining of all remaining color. Morrison's voice came through the radio, but this time it wasn't just urgent, it was panicked. Hutchins, tell me you didn't hurt him. Tell me he's okay. He's fine, Captain, but what's? The National Guard has been activated, and they're not coming to help you. The first helicopter touched down in the empty field behind the community center, the downdraft sending dust and debris flying. The crowd scattered slightly, shielding their eyes. Marcus stared, his military training helping him recognize the markings on the choppers. These weren't local, these were federal. The helicopter door slid open, and uniformed officers began climbing out. Not National Guardsmen in training gear. These were high-ranking officials, moving with purpose and authority that made even the watching police officers stand at attention. James, standing at the community center entrance with Lisa, didn't look surprised. He looked tired, like this was something he'd hoped to avoid but had prepared for anyway. "Colonel," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking, "what's happening?" James watched the figures approaching from the helicopter, then glanced back at Hutchins, still standing frozen beside his patrol car. "Remember that envelope I mentioned," James said quietly. "The one I suggested he check." Lisa nodded, not understanding. "It was an official Department of Defense notification. I'm being activated for a special assignment." He paused, his expression unreadable. "As of this morning, I'm no longer just a retired colonel. I've been recalled to active duty with a provisional promotion pending Senate confirmation." Lisa's eyes widened. Promotion to what? James looked at the approaching officers, then back at the crowd, then finally at Officer Derek Hutchins. "Brigadier General." But what happened next changed everything. The ranking officer from the lead helicopter, a stern-faced man with salt and pepper hair and enough medals on his chest to weigh down a lesser man, strode across the parking lot with a purpose that made even the bystanders instinctively straighten. His name tape read Harrison, and the stars on his shoulders marked him as a 2-star major general. Behind him marched an aide carrying a tablet and what looked like official documentation, followed by 2 military police officers. Officer Hutchins watched them approach, his mouth hanging open, his body language shifting from defensive to something approaching panic. Miller had already backed up to their patrol car, his hand on the door handle, ready to distance himself further. Sarah Chen's camera phone captured every second as Major General Harrison walked directly past Hutchins without even glancing at him and approached James at the community center entrance. Harrison stopped 5 feet away and rendered a crisp salute. "Colonel Carter, sir." James, despite everything that had just happened, despite the pain in his knee and the marks on his wrists, returned the salute with equal precision. His back straightened, decades of military bearing snapping into place like muscle memory. "General Harrison, I didn't expect the escort." There was the slightest edge of dry humor in James's voice. "The Pentagon got word that local law enforcement was interfering with your movements," Harrison said, his voice carrying across the silent parking lot. "Given the sensitivity of your upcoming assignment and your new security clearance, we couldn't take chances. When they tried your cell and got no answer, they activated emergency protocols." James pulled his phone from his pocket, nodding the 7 missed calls. "I had it silenced for the meeting." Harrison's jaw tightened as his eyes took in the scene. The crowd, the cameras, the police cars, and the visible marks on James's wrists. His gaze finally landed on Hutchins, and when it did, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Officer, did you put your hands on this man?" Hutchins opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Sir, I didn't know." "Did you put your hands on him? Yes or no?" The crowd pressed closer, hungry for this moment. Marcus had his phone out now, live-streaming everything. The viewer count was climbing into the thousands. He was non-compliant. "That's a yes." Harrison turned to one of the MPs. "Document everything. Photos, witness statements, video footage from every angle. This will be forwarded to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the Inspector General's office." "Sir, with all due respect," Hutchins started, but Captain Morrison's voice cut through his radio. "Hutchins, shut up. Don't say another word without a union rep present." But Hutchins, drowning now, couldn't stop himself. "I was just doing my job. He was parked illegally. He refused to provide proper identification." "He owns the property," Harrison said, his voice like a hammer on ice. "And his identification, the military ID you apparently ignored, clearly shows his rank and service record. But even if he was a private citizen with no connection to the military, your behavior was unacceptable." James held up a hand. "General, if I may, this situation has already escalated beyond what I intended. I came here for a veterans meeting, not to create an international incident." "International," Lisa whispered. Harrison's expression softened slightly when he looked at James. "Colonel, excuse me, General-designate Carter, you're being modest. Your assignment briefing was classified, but given current circumstances." He glanced at the crowd, the cameras weighing his words. "Your work advising NATO on veteran reintegration programs has caught the attention of some very important people. The Secretary of Defense personally approved your recall and promotion. You're not just a retired officer anymore. You're a federal asset with top-secret clearance and an upcoming Senate confirmation hearing." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Sarah Chen's fingers flew across her phone. Marcus felt his chest swell with pride, even as anger burned at how James had been treated. Lisa gripped James's arm tighter, understanding now just how catastrophic Hutchins's mistake truly was. A second helicopter had landed, and now more figures emerged, these ones in suits rather than uniforms. Federal agents, by the look of them. One of them made a beeline for Sarah Chen. "Ma'am, I need to see that footage." Sarah pulled her phone closer. "I'm press, First Amendment." "Not asking for it to be deleted," the agent said quickly, showing credentials. "But we need copies for the investigation. This incident involves a federal official, which triggers mandatory review protocols." A third black SUV pulled into the parking lot. No lights, no sirens, just dark windows and government plates. Men and women in professional attire climbed out, setting up what looked like a mobile command post. This small-town incident was transforming into a federal case in real time. Hutchins finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of what he'd done. His face had gone from red to gray, and his hands trembled as he removed his sunglasses. "I didn't know," he said again, but this time it wasn't defiant. It was plaintive, desperate. James turned to face him fully for the first time since the helicopters arrived. The parking lot fell silent, except for the whir of rotors winding down. "Officer Hutchins," James said, his voice not loud but carrying nonetheless. "You didn't know because you didn't ask, you didn't look. You saw an old black man sitting in a car and decided he was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected." "I treat everyone the same," Hutchins tried, but even he couldn't finish the lie. "Do you?" James took a slow step forward. His knee ached, but he didn't let it show. "Would you have yanked a 78-year-old white man from his vehicle for parking in a spot he had permission to use? Would you have dropped his identification on the ground? Would you have cuffed him, injured him, humiliated him in front of his community?" Hutchins said nothing. His silence was answer enough. "I've spent 38 years serving this country," James continued. "I've commanded troops in combat. I've advised presidents. I've lost friends in wars most Americans don't even remember. And today I came to volunteer at a community center I helped build in the town where I was born, and you treated me like I was less than human." Someone in the crowd was crying. Marcus realized it was him. "This isn't about me," James said, his voice rising slightly. "I have resources, I have connections, I can fight back. But what about the people who can't? What about the veterans I mentor who have PTSD and can't handle aggressive police interactions? What about the elderly residents of this community who don't have lawyers on speed dial? How many of them have you treated this way, Officer Hutchins? How many didn't have helicopters show up to prove their worth?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. Several people in the crowd shouted their agreement, sharing their own stories of police mistreatment. The moment was crystallizing into something bigger than one incident. It was becoming a reckoning. General Harrison stepped forward, his voice formal and official. "Officer Hutchins, as of this moment, you are being detained for questioning regarding assault on a federal official, violation of civil rights under color of law, and possible obstruction of a federal assignment. You have the right to remain silent." "Wait," a new voice cut through the proceedings. A woman in an expensive suit pushed through the crowd, her phone pressed to her ear. She flashed a badge, Internal Affairs. "General, I need a word. Captain Morrison sent me. This needs to be handled properly to preserve the integrity of multiple investigations." Harrison frowned but nodded. The IA investigator approached Hutchins, speaking in low, urgent tones. Miller finally abandoned all pretense of solidarity and walked over to give his statement to one of the federal agents, distancing himself from his partner with every word. But even as official processes began, statements taken, videos documented, reports filed, the crowd remained. They weren't leaving until they saw justice, real justice. James felt the weight of all those eyes on him. He'd never wanted this kind of attention. Had spent his entire military career avoiding the spotlight, letting his work speak for itself. But standing here now, with his community watching, with young veterans like Marcus looking to him for guidance, he understood that his silence would be read as permission. Permission for this to keep happening. Permission for men like Hutchins to continue wielding authority like a weapon. He couldn't give that permission, not anymore. A news van from a major Atlanta station screeched into the parking lot, satellite dish already rising. Then another. The story was spreading beyond Riverside now, beyond Georgia. Colonel Carter started trending on Twitter. News alerts pinged across phones statewide. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., in offices where decisions were made that shaped nations, people were watching. People who just approved James's promotion and assignment. People who were now seeing, in real time, exactly the kind of discrimination and injustice that James's upcoming work was meant to address. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The confrontation reached its peak when Captain Morrison arrived in person, his face red from rushing, his uniform slightly disheveled. He took one look at the scene, the helicopters, the federal agents, the crowd, the cameras, and his shoulders sagged. "Jesus Christ, Hutchins," he muttered. Then, louder, addressing Harrison. "General, I'm Captain Richard Morrison, Precinct Commander. I want to personally apologize for—" "Save it," Harrison said curtly. "Your apology means nothing to me. Direct it to General Designate Carter. And then direct your energy toward explaining to the FBI why your department failed to properly train officers on identifying military credentials and respecting federal officials." Morrison's face went white. FBI? This was escalating into territory he had no experience with. Small-town police misconduct was one thing. Federal investigations were entirely different. He turned to James, who stood watching with that same unreadable expression. "Colonel, General, sir, I don't know what to say. This should never have happened. Hutchins has been a problem officer for months, but I never thought he'd—" "You knew he was a problem," James interrupted, his voice quiet but sharp. "And yet he was still on the streets, still carrying a badge and gun, still in a position to harm people. How many complaints has he racked up, Captain? How many were swept under the rug?" Morrison's silence was damning. Lisa Matthews stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "I've filed 3 complaints about Hutchins myself, 3 separate incidents involving community center members. Black kids getting harassed for playing basketball too loud. An elderly woman accused of trespassing when she was sitting on a bench. Each time, nothing happened. You told me it was being handled internally. And handled internally means buried, Marcus called out from the crowd. We all know how this works. The crowd rumbled its agreement. Phones continued recording. Sarah Chen's story was already being picked up by national outlets. This wasn't just about one bad cop anymore. It was about systemic failure, institutional protection of abusive officers, the gap between what justice was supposed to be and what it actually looked like for communities like Riverside. James looked at Morrison, then at Hutchins, then at the crowd of faces, black, white, Latino, Asian, young, and old, all united in their outrage at what they'd witnessed. I'm not interested in revenge, James said finally, but I am interested in accountability. Officer Hutchins will face consequences for his actions today. That much is certain. But this can't end with one officer. The system that allowed this to happen, that has allowed it to keep happening, needs to change. He turned to General Harrison. I want a full audit of this precinct's complaint records. I want every case involving discrimination or excessive force reopened and reviewed by federal investigators. And I want a comprehensive retraining program for every officer in this department on civil rights, de-escalation, and proper protocol for interacting with vulnerable populations. Harrison nodded. I'll make it happen. You can't just, Morrison started, but James cut him off with a look that had silenced insubordinate soldiers across 3 continents. Captain, I've been authorized by the Department of Defense to assess and recommend improvements to veteran services and treatment in civilian communities. This precinct's treatment of veterans, including today's incident, falls squarely within my mandate. You can cooperate voluntarily, or you can explain to a congressional oversight committee why you resisted federal intervention. Your choice. Morrison's mouth opened and closed. Finally, he nodded. We'll cooperate fully. Hutchins, who'd been standing silently while IA whispered in his ear, finally cracked. This is insane. I made a mistake, okay? I admit it, but ruining my career over a parking dispute. A parking dispute? James's voice could have frozen lava. You assaulted me, you humiliated me, you violated my civil rights, you interfered with federal operations, you abused your authority, and based on what I'm hearing, I'm far from your first victim. This isn't about a parking spot, officer. This is about decades of unchecked aggression, systemic racism, and a badge used as a weapon against the very people you're supposed to protect. I'm not racist, Hutchins shouted, and the crowd actually laughed bitter, knowing laughter. Marcus pushed to the fence. Man, you called him you people. We all heard it. It's on video. That's not, I didn't mean, Hutchins floundered. You meant exactly what you said, James replied. And that's the problem. You don't even recognize your own bias. You think you're entitled to treat people differently based on how they look, where they come from, what you assume about them. And the system has protected that behavior for so long you genuinely believe you've done nothing wrong. He took a step closer to Hutchins, and despite James being unarmed and 30 years older, Hutchins flinched. I could have died today, James said softly, the words carrying despite their quiet delivery. I have a heart condition. The stress of this encounter, the physical aggression, my doctor would tell you I shouldn't be subjected to situations like this. If I'd had a heart attack in that parking lot, would you have rendered aid? Or would you have assumed I was resisting? The question was rhetorical, but everyone knew the answer. Statistics didn't lie. Black men died in police custody at alarming rates. James's military rank and federal connections had saved him, but how many others didn't have those protections? An older black woman in the crowd called out, her voice breaking. My grandson Jamal had an encounter with this officer last year. Jamal has autism. He doesn't make eye contact, doesn't respond quickly to commands. Hutchins threw him to the ground, gave him a concussion, said he was resisting. My grandson is 15 years old and weighs 130 pounds. Other voices joined hers, a litany of abuse, a catalog of harm, story after story of Hutchins targeting the vulnerable, the marginalized, the people least able to fight back. Each testimony recorded, documented, added to the growing pile of evidence. The IA investigators' face grew grimmer with each account. This wasn't just one bad incident. This was a pattern, a history, the kind of case that ended careers and sparked federal consent decrees. Hutchins seemed to shrink with each new story, his earlier defiance crumbling into something approaching horror. Maybe he genuinely hadn't understood the impact of his actions. Maybe he'd convinced himself that his aggression was justified, that the people he hurt had somehow deserved it. But faced with the accumulated weight of his victim's testimony, even his delusions couldn't hold. "I want to take a polygraph," Hutchins said suddenly, desperately. "I'll prove I'm not racist. I'll prove I was just doing my job." "Your actions prove what you are," James said. "Your words are irrelevant." General Harrison checked his watch, then nodded to his aide. "We need to move, General Carter. Your briefing in Washington is in 6 hours, and we still need medical evaluation after this incident." James nodded, then turned to the crowd. "Thank you, all of you, for bearing witness, for recording, for refusing to look away. That's how change happens. Not because people in power suddenly develop consciences, but because regular citizens refuse to accept injustice." The crowd erupted in applause. People reached out to shake his hand, to thank him, to share their own stories. James took time with each one, knowing that this moment mattered more than any briefing or ceremony. Lisa hugged him tightly. "You didn't deserve this." "No," James agreed. "But I can survive it. That's the privilege of rank and resources. We need to fight for the people who can't." Marcus approached, tears streaming down his face. "Sir, I froze. When I saw what was happening, I wanted to help, but I froze. I'm sorry." James gripped the young man's shoulder. "You survived. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Too many young black men have died trying to intervene in situations like this. You protected yourself, and there's no shame in that. But now you can help in other ways. Tell your story, be a witness. That matters just as much." Marcus nodded, and James saw something shift in the younger veteran's eyes. Purpose, maybe, or resolve. Sarah Chen approached last, her press badge prominently displayed. "General Carter, can I ask you a few questions for my article?" James smiled slightly. "I have a feeling I'll be answering a lot of questions in the coming days, but yes, let's talk." They stepped aside, and Sarah asked the questions that mattered. What needs to change? How can communities hold police accountable? What message does he have for other veterans facing discrimination? James answered each thoughtfully, knowing his words would be parsed by policymakers, activists, and regular citizens trying to make sense of a broken system. As he spoke, federal agents continued their work. Hutchins was officially placed under arrest, read his rights, and escorted to one of the black SUVs. Miller gave his statement, distancing himself from his partner's actions with every sentence. Morrison coordinated with IA, his career likely over even if he faced no criminal charges. Failing to control problem officers was a career killer in itself. The news vans multiplied. Local coverage gave way to national attention. By evening, James's name and face would be on every major network. By tomorrow, congressional hearings would be announced. By next week, the Department of Justice would have an open investigation into the entire Riverside Police Department. One parking lot encounter, one officer's racism and aggression, and the entire system was being forced to confront itself. As the sun began to set over Riverside, Georgia, James finally climbed into the helicopter that would take him to Washington. General Harrison sat across from him, reviewing briefing documents. "Hell of a day," Harrison said, not looking up from his tablet. "Indeed," James replied, watching his hometown recede below. The community center, the parking lot where it all happened, the crowd still gathered despite the late hour, all of it shrinking to toy size as they gained altitude. "The Senate confirmation hearing next week is going to be interesting," Harrison continued. "This incident will definitely come up." "I'd be disappointed if it didn't," James said. "My work is supposed to address exactly these kinds of systemic issues. If I can't speak to experiencing them firsthand, what credibility do I have?" Harrison finally looked up, studying James. "You're remarkably calm about all this." James smiled, but there was no humor in it. "General, I've been black in America for 78 years. I've been a black soldier, a black officer, a black leader. I've navigated racism subtle and overt in every environment from boot camp to the Pentagon. Today was shocking in its brazenness, but not in its existence. I stopped being surprised by racism a long time ago. Harrison searched for words. That's unbearably sad. Yes, James agreed. It is, but it's also reality, and the only way to change reality is to confront it directly. They flew in silence for a moment. Below, Georgia's red earth gave way to suburbs, then cities, the landscape transforming as they headed north. The medical team will want to check you over when we land, Harrison said. The wrist marks the knee injury. I'm fine, James said. Soldiers have endured worse. You're not just a soldier anymore. You're a symbol. What happened to you today happened to every veteran who's been profiled, harassed, or abused by the system they fought to protect. Your injuries, physical and otherwise, matter to a lot of people. James looked down at his wrists, at the red marks already fatting but still visible. Evidence. Proof. A reminder that rank and service and dignity meant nothing to men like Officer Derek Hutchins. His phone buzzed with notifications, hundreds of them. Messages of support from fellow veterans. News alerts about the incident. Requests for interviews. Statements from civil rights organizations, veteran advocacy groups, political figures weighing in. One message stood out, from his daughter serving overseas as an Army captain herself. Dad saw the news. Are you okay? I'm so angry I can't see straight. Love you. James typed back, I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry about me. Focus on your mission. We'll talk soon. Another message, this one from Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Armed Services Committee. General Carter, we stand with you. This cannot stand. Let's discuss next steps. The machine was already in motion. Forces larger than one man, one incident, one small town were mobilizing. James hadn't sought this attention, this platform. But now that he had it, he'd be damned if he wasted it. When we land, James said to Harrison, I want to review every pending case of veteran mistreatment in police custody nationwide. I want data on racial disparities in how veterans are treated post-service. I want to know every single gap in the system that allows incidents like today to happen. Harrison nodded. I'll have my team compile everything by morning. Good, James looked out the window at the darkening sky. Because what happened to me today, that was just the symptom. We need to cure the disease. The helicopter carried them toward Washington, toward briefings and hearings and the machinery of federal power. Behind them, in Riverside, the community that had witnessed injustice was already organizing. Lisa Matthews had called an emergency town hall. Marcus Thompson was drafting a petition demanding police reform. Sarah Chen's article was being shared across social media, sparking conversations in communities across the nation. And in the Riverside Police Department, Officer Derek Hutchins sat in an interrogation room, his career in ruins, his future uncertain, finally understanding that the man he'd casually brutalized wasn't just an elderly black man he could intimidate with impunity. He was a decorated war hero, a community leader, a soon-to-be general with Pentagon connections and a federal mandate to root out exactly the kind of discrimination Hutchins had displayed. Hutchins had grabbed the wrong man on the wrong day in the worst possible way, and the consequences of that would ripple through the criminal justice system for years to come. But that reckoning, total and absolute, was still to come. 3 days later, James sat in a Senate hearing room, his uniform pressed and perfect, his bearing impeccable. Senators from both parties filled the raised semicircle of desks, their aides behind them, cameras recording every word. Senator Williams opened the hearing. General-designate Carter, let's address the elephant in the room. The incident in Georgia has sparked national outrage and calls for reform. Can you walk us through what happened and how it relates to your proposed work with the Veterans Affairs Advisory Board? James leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady and clear. Senator, what happened to me in Riverside, Georgia, is what happens to too many veterans, particularly veterans of color, every day. We ask them to serve their country with honor. We train them to follow rules, respect authority, maintain discipline. And then we return them to communities where authority figures treat them as threats rather than heroes. He paused, letting that sink in. Cameras clicked. Reporters scribbled notes. Officer Hutchins saw an elderly black man and made assumptions. He didn't check my credentials. He didn't ask questions. He didn't show basic human respect. And when I tried to de-escalate, using the same conflict resolution skills the military taught me, he responded with aggression and force. That's a training failure. That's a systemic failure. And it's my job, if confirmed, to address those failures at every level. Senator Thomas Breckinridge, a conservative from Texas known for his law and order stance, leaned forward. General Carter, with all due respect, isn't it possible Officer Hutchins simply made an error in judgment? Do we really need federal intervention every time there's a local police matter? James met his eyes directly. Senator, would you ask that question if the victim had been a white four-star general? If General Mattis or General Petraeus had been dragged from their vehicles, cuffed, and humiliated in a parking lot, would you call that an error in judgment, or would you call it an outrage? The room went silent. Breckinridge's face reddened, but he had no response. This wasn't an isolated incident, James continued. Investigation records show Officer Hutchins has a documented history of targeting minorities, particularly black residents. He has 16 excessive force complaints, 7 racial profiling complaints, and 3 formal reprimands that were never enforced. The system protected him. The system enabled him. And the system will continue producing officers like him, unless we fundamentally change how we train, supervise, and hold accountable those who wear the badge. Senator Williams nodded. And your recommendations? Mandatory training on implicit bias and de-escalation. Community oversight boards with real power. Federal standards for complaint investigations. Consequences for departments that protect problem officers. And specific protocols for interacting with veterans who may have PTSD, trauma, or medical conditions that require specialized approaches. He straightened in his chair. But more than that, we need cultural change. Police departments need to see themselves as servants of the community, not occupiers of it. They need to understand that respect isn't automatic, it's earned. And they need to recognize that their power comes with profound responsibility to use it justly. The hearing continued for 3 more hours. James answered every question with precision and authority, his experience and credibility unassailable. By the time it concluded, even his harshest critics had fallen silent. The vote for confirmation was unanimous. General James William Carter would take his new post with a mandate for change and the full backing of the Senate. Outside the hearing room, reporters swarmed. James gave brief statements, thanking the Senate, acknowledging the support from veteran communities and promising real reform. General Carter, one reporter shouted, Officer Hutchins was fired and is facing federal charges. Do you feel justice has been served? James paused, considering. Justice for me personally, perhaps, but justice for the system? That's a much longer journey. Firing one officer doesn't fix the culture that created him. We have a lot of work to do. What message do you have for other veterans facing discrimination? Document everything. Know your rights. Don't resist, but don't accept injustice either. And know that there are people fighting for you. Systems change slowly, but they do change. We just have to keep pushing. One more question, another reporter called. What's your message to police officers who are watching this? James looked directly into the camera, his expression serious but not angry. You have one of the hardest jobs in America, I understand that, but difficulty doesn't excuse cruelty. Challenge doesn't excuse discrimination. If you can't treat every person with basic human dignity, regardless of their race, age, appearance, or how much power you think they have, then you're in the wrong profession. The badge is supposed to mean protection, not oppression. Be worthy of it. The statement went viral within hours. #Be worthy of it became a rallying cry for reform advocates. Police unions issued carefully worded responses. Some officers posted videos agreeing with James's message. Others doubled down on defensive posturing. The conversation, long overdue, was finally happening at national scale. 6 months later, James returned to Riverside for the first time since the incident. The community center, now officially renamed the Colonel James William Carter Veterans Resource Center, despite his protests, had been renovated again with a federal grant he'd helped secure. New programs served homeless veterans, veterans with PTSD, veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life. Marcus Thompson ran the mentorship program, his own trauma channeled into helping others. Lisa Matthews had been promoted to Regional Director of Veteran Services. Sarah Chen's reporting on the incident had won state journalism awards and sparked similar investigations in 3 other states. And Officer Derek Hutchins? He'd pleaded guilty to civil rights violations, assault on a federal official, and abuse of authority. He was serving 18 months in federal prison and would never wear a badge again. His case had become a landmark example of accountability, referenced in law enforcement training nationwide. The Riverside Police Department had been placed under a federal consent decree, required to implement sweeping reforms. Captain Morrison had retired early. The new chief was a black woman with a doctorate in criminal justice and a reputation for holding her officers to the highest standards. James stood in the renovated center, surrounded by veterans, some he'd mentored for years, others new to the program. They shared stories, laughed, supported each other. This was what he'd envisioned all those years ago when he donated the funds to build this place. A safe space, a community. Marcus approached, now confident where he'd once been hesitant. "General, we've got 20 new veterans enrolled this month. Your story inspired people to reach out to ask for help. We're making a real difference." James smiled, genuine warmth in his expression. It was always about more than just me. The attention, the outrage, that had to translate into action or it meant nothing. It did, Marcus assured him. Across the country, veterans programs are getting more funding. Police departments are changing policies. People are listening. A young black woman in an Army uniform approached, hesitant. "General Carter, I'm Private First Class Taylor. I'm shipping out to my first deployment next month. I just wanted to thank you. Your story, everything you've done, it makes me proud to serve. Makes me believe things can get better." James took her hand, holding it between both of his. "They will get better because of people like you. Stay strong, stay smart. And when you come home, know that there are people here ready to support you. You're never alone in this." She saluted, tears in her eyes, and walked away holding her head higher than when she'd arrived. As the sun set over Riverside, James sat on the community center steps, the same steps he'd climbed that terrible day 6 months ago after being dragged from his car. But everything had changed. The world knew his story now. The system was being forced to confront its failures, and veterans across America had a voice they hadn't had before. Lisa sat beside him, handing him sweet tea in a glass, sweating with condensation. "Hell of a journey." "Hell of a journey," James agreed. He sipped the tea, savoring the taste of home. "You know what's funny? I spent 38 years in the military trying to change the system from inside. One traffic stop accomplished more reform than decades of official recommendations." "That's not funny," Lisa said quietly. "That's tragic." "Both," James admitted. "But I'll take tragedy that leads to change over silence that preserves injustice." They sat together as night fell, watching veterans come and go from the center. Each one a story. Each one a battle fought not on foreign soil but in everyday life. Each one deserving of dignity, respect, and the support of a grateful nation. James's phone buzzed. Another interview request, another congressional testimony, another opportunity to push for reform. The work never stopped. But for tonight, in this moment, he allowed himself to simply be present, to witness the community he'd helped build, to know that his pain had purchased something valuable, accountability. Officer Derek Hutchins had dragged him from his car that day, thinking he was just another old black man to intimidate and control. But he'd grabbed hold of a force that wouldn't be silenced. A lifetime of service, dignity, and moral authority that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. And when the National Guard arrived, when the helicopters descended, when the full weight of federal power mobilized to protect one of its own, Hutchins learned what so many others had failed to understand. True authority doesn't come from a badge or a gun. It comes from character, service, and the respect you've earned through a lifetime of standing for what's right. General James William Carter had that authority. and he would use every bit of it to ensure that what happened to him would happen to fewer and fewer veterans with each passing year. The work was just beginning, but the foundation was solid, and change, slow and hard won, was finally coming.